everyone, my name's Adrian.
My name's Aaron.
Welcome back to Teach One, the health and wellness podcast that aims to empower you by improving your awareness of your mental, social, and physical being through shared experience. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Thank you for investing in yourself. Subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to your podcast and join our community on Facebook and Instagram at TWOTEACHONE and on our website at www.2teachone.com. That's www.2teachone.com.
To teach one.
Today we're going to break the monotony of some of the heavier topics that we usually discuss and talk about something that we've kind of done this before, right? We love history and we love having these open discussions. Yeah. And so today we're going to discuss the Black Plague.
Yeah, dude, I am so psyched, man. So I've done a little bit of research, right? And I just want to kind of roll right in, right? So the Black Plague was formed out of Roanoke, Virginia. They combine aggressively melodic guitar riffs, thunderous bass tones, powerful and technical drums, and a massive range of vocals from screams to cleans to form a style of metal all their own, with widespread influences from Mudvayne and Protest the Hero to Arch Enemy and Lamb of God. The band has taken every moment since they formed in 2013 to cultivate and hone their sound and bring that to the professional stage in their growing list of fans. Black Plague has had the pleasure of sharing the stage with bands such as Godsmack, Lamb of God, A Day to Remember, Of Mice and Men, The Offspring, Upon a Burning Body, All That Remains, Unearth, I Prevail, Beartooth, Mushroom Head, Avatar, Butcher Babies, Soil, Power Man 5000, Saliva, Soften the Glare, Dead Horse Trauma, Conquer Divide, and many more. Their newest EP, Existence, was released in mid-April 18, recorded and produced by Jamie King of the Basement Studio.
Wait.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the Black Plague we're talking about.
What do you mean?
The Black Plague as in the pestilence, the disease, the Black Plague of 13 what? From the 1300s. Well, it depends on which one you're talking about. Mm-hmm. In Europe, it was the 1300s.
So we're not talking about the Black Plague, the band?
No.
The up-and-coming, hard rock dude?
Bro.
Okay. Well, I mean...
Is that what all your research was based on?
Dude, it's all out the window now, man. It's all out the window, dude. Well, I had biographies. Dude, you should see, they got some sweet, beard stuff going down.
How's their merch game?
Merch game's strong, dude. And they're also available, if you want to look them up. I'm just saying, okay, we can talk about the Black Plague. Fortunately, I'm pretty well versed in history, so I think I can roll with what we were going to talk about.
I'm sure you
can.
But
I'm just saying you should check them out, right? I think they're up and coming. I think you might hear some more from the Black Plague.
Thank you.
If you're out there listening, Black Plague, dude, stay strong, man.
Yo,
also, Dead Horse Trauma, greatest band name ever. I'm just saying, I don't know, I've never heard of Dead Horse Trauma, but I'm just saying, rock. If you can't see me, I'm doing the horns right now.
Okay, all right.
Okay,
so
Aaron,
no, I appreciate you, man. I really do. You know what I do? What I do really appreciate is that we have some, guests in the house. One of which is the Flo and Owen.
Nice.
Who brought some research also. So hopefully he's not doing the same thing.
We'll find out. Yeah.
We've got Flo and Owen, okay, and we've got David the Beard.
Yeah. Man.
What's up?
Technical Whiz, newest edition. Yeah, we're psyched.
Yeah, we haven't even really gotten to that. Sometime we're gonna have to have an onboarding for David.
Okay.
So we could just let him talk to us about what he plans to do.
Yeah.
Looking forward.
Yeah.
So are y'all not here to talk about heavy metal?
No.
I am.
Oh, all right. See, okay. Yeah. David's with it. Okay. It's cool. We'll switch gears. I'm just saying, it's no big deal. Black Plague, it's an honest mistake, right? It's an honest mistake, right?
Happens all the time.
Yeah,
If anything, I'm just impressed at, the way you approached it with such energy and enthusiasm. You know what I'm saying? You really went for it. So, hey, there's that. It's all good, man.
Yeah, it was cool. It's kind of like the episode we did on cancer. Remember, I thought it was going to be all about the sign cancer, and it turns out it was about the disease. I mean, who knew, right?
Astrology is important, too.
Also happens all the time.
Yeah, right?
Yes.
So real quick, guys, let's just get straight into black death metal.
Yes, right? Yeah.
We should have had Jacob here for that one.
Oh, yeah, he'll shift
Right.
that.
If we're going to have that discussion, Jacob has to be here, man.
Oh, yeah.
The
Most
white
definitely.
shark, man. All right. Yeah. So anyway,
Where are we at?
Black Plague.
The Black Plague.
The Black Plague. But it didn't just take place in Europe. There's lots of history that, behind the Black Plague and the different types of plagues, right? And, we have a friend of ours, Flo and Owen, that is actually, going to be a doctor sometime soon. But he was very enthusiastic about this topic. There was just kind of a glint in his eye when we mentioned what we wanted to talk about. What was that about, man? You got really excited.
All right, so taking it back to sophomore year of high school right here.
Okay.
Nice.
So in my history class, we learned about some of this stuff, and I really don't remember much about it, to be honest. So
Yeah.
I did some research, some homework, and that was it. But I knew enough, and he taught me well enough to where I realized that this topic, like other great historical events or like
Right.
timelines,
Right.
we can talk about through all sorts of different perspectives. So we can talk about how this influenced art, society, politics, individuals, all sorts of different things.
Right.
And so I thought that the Black Plague as a topic was a wealthy topic.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I definitely think so. And then, I'm also particularly interested in, some of the medical aspects, right? Because
Yes.
there's some things I looked up like the plague doctors, right? Like, why did they wear those masks with the beaks? It's amazing. They thought that, it spread through the air,
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll talk about all that stuff,
Yeah,
right?
it kind of did sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Maybe, right?
Maybe, right?
Well, no, and it's fascinating to talk about historical topics like that because even though it happened in, the 14th century, and we're living, 600 years later, it still had this massive impact on the society that we have today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you kind of forget about that, right?
Right.
And there's all this myth and legend that grew up out of that. And then, separating the truth from the fiction and kind of learning about what life was like so long ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. So, let's get started, man.
Let's do it.
Teach us, teacher.
Where are we starting?
Where we start? Where do you want to start?
So there's a few spheres that when I was taking notes popped out to me.
Okay.
There's the historical context. What was going on before the Black Plague, just in the world at that time. So
Right.
that's a big one,
Sure,
the
yeah.
timeline, the years, nations involved, all that
Right.
sort of stuff. The beginning of the plague is very interesting. So that was like a whole different topic. How did we go from, one person being sick to, millions and millions of people dying over
Right.
like a couple decades and sometimes even within a couple years? The science behind it. Obviously, you talked about that a little bit, Adrian. I think that's really interesting, as well as the social aspects. To me, that I'm the most excited actually talking about this.
Right.
Almost like role playing and just talking about like, what would it be like if 70% of your city
Yeah.
dies?
Right? What would you do?
Yeah.
How would services function?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Yeah.
And then one other thing that I thought was interesting was, like Aaron was talking about, was outcomes or like repercussions of the Black Plague. And then after that, there's a little bit about the controversy of the illness, what caused it, were there a couple different diseases going around, how were they spread, was it by rats, was it by fleas, was it carried by humans?
Yeah.
There's all sorts of different ideas on that. So yeah, that was like the first thing that stuck out to me when I was doing research, is like just how wealthy this topic was. So yeah, I guess let's get into it, huh, guys?
Yeah. So from a historical perspective,
Yeah, let's start with the history.
what I was surprised to know is that it when people think about the Black Plague, you're just thinking about like what's really been depicted the most, right? Which is how it took place in Europe, right? And, the effects and all that. But that wasn't the only place the plague has existed. So, tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so before we get to talking about the history of how the plague hit, maybe we should take a moment to talk about what the plague is, right? So technically the plague is any major disease, like a plague is a major disease that wipes out a lot of people. I mean, it's a simple explanation. It's not hugely scientific. But when we're talking about the Black Plague, the interesting thing is nobody really knows. So it isn't like it is now where you have scientists who, like, for instance, when something happens with Ebola and we hear about that, The reason they know it's Ebola is they find a sick person, they withdraw some fluids, some kind of skin, and they look at it, right? And they have another thing they look at, and they go, oh, these match up. They look at it under a microscope. So microscopes aren't invented back then. Modern scientific methods aren't invented back then. So nobody knows. But later plagues that happened in the 18th and 19th century lead most scientists to think that it caused by a Y pestis. That's Y. pestis. So the idea is, and this is the common understanding of what happened with Y. pestis, is that it was spread by rats and the fleas that were on rats. And it was very interesting because Owen and I were talking about this earlier. There's this really kind of gross but interesting deal where the fleas, right, you know, were getting their insides blocked up, so they weren't getting any nutrients, which made them even hungrier, so they burrowed in even more to their hosts, and then they were actually regurgitating this stuff right into these wounds, which really spread this bacteria. And the thing with the Black Plague is there were several different forms, right? So a lot of people hear about the bubonic plague, and that's just one form of how this bacterium spreads, and that can knock you out in like a week, right? So, I mean, we have people who are just, you know, feeling sick one day and then 4 days later they're dead, which is, you know, pretty drastic. I mean, even today when you get a disease that's going to take you out or that's terminal, you have months, years, you know.
The onset was so rapid.
Yeah, very rapid. And so we've talked a little bit about that. And so it's interesting that like if you were to go to the History Channel website and you were to look up the Black Plague, you would hear about these 12 ships that entered this harbor in Italy in, I think, you know, the time period is the late 1200s, the early 1300s, and that's kind of where they think that it started, right? But it's a very Eurocentric way to look at it. It really started in China, right? The Silk Road, the trade coming from China, that's where they think that the plague started and then spread into Europe through trade routes. And once it began to affect the major cities of Europe, right, just all hell breaks loose, basically.
Right.
You know, people start dropping like flies. Again, this is a time before any type of understanding of germ theory, of bacteria. They had no idea there was this entire world of tiny things that were affecting them. So that you get into this whole issue of what is even causing this, and they didn't know, you know. I wanted to, you know, go directly to one of the sources here. Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, there's a few things you've already mentioned that are really interesting. The first is that when I learned about this, and generally I think when most people think about this, it's generally framed as a Eurocentric disease, right? Yeah. But like the vast amount of numbers that died in Europe are potentially very equivalent to what died, or the amount of people that died in Asia. Yeah. Potentially like 1-to-1 or very close. And that's pretty wild that the Black Plague is pitched as a European disaster.
Right. Well, and it's interesting too, we often forget that Europe and Asia are technically one continent.
Yeah.
You know? And so anything that affects Europe is going to affect Asia and vice versa. Especially because there was a lot of trade going on, you know, through them. And also the Middle East was hit extremely hard, you know? Yep. Some of the early kingdoms, you know, Turkey or what is modern day Turkey in that area.
Yep. A few things real quick. First of all, this Black Plague we're talking about now, it's generally, numbers are thrown around about 25 million to maybe 50 million on the high end, maybe 100 million casualties. In 542 AD to the middle 700s AD, in Turkey, in Istanbul, which was back then the city of Constantinople. Actually, I don't know if that's a city or nation. Do you know that?
It's a city.
It's a city. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And, at the height of the Black Plague in Paris, about 800 or 900 people a day were dying. In Constantinople, during that time frame, the 542 to mid 700s AD, 10,000 people every day were dying from the Black Plague that they had back then.
Wow.
10,000 every day. And then estimates indicate that half of Europe's population, about 100 million, died before, like as a result of that plague.
Wow. The 542 plague?
Yep.
Wow.
Would you say 10,000 a day?
Yes.
Dude, if that happened today, can you imagine the response?
It's a lot of empty homes.
Oh, dude.
Yeah.
Just like think about it, just ghost towns everywhere.
Yeah,
man,
and
that would be so crazy.
And what do you do with the people? You can't hold funeral services, and you can't bury 10,000 people.
Yep.
What do you do with them?
Wow,
Burn
man.
them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's literally
yeah.
what you have to do.
You have to, yeah.
And yeah,
Oh, yeah, feel free.
So for everyone listening, David just reached around the microphone and asked Adrian if we're alled to curse.
like a
Yeah.
gentleman.
How
and
censored
then
is this?
Arian and Adrian real quickly said, "Fuck yeah."
We don't go out of our way, but it's certainly acceptable. As an adult.
Listen, censorship and political correctness is something that is starting to plague our society, and we like to be a little bit more free here.
You know,
Right on.
I mean,
I don't know if this is the right podcast to use plague, but yeah, sure.
Oh. Well done.
excellent. But yeah, it's amazing that, so this whole thing had happened before, just further back in history.
Yes.
And I think it's sort of happened ever so often throughout all of human history. Now, we're not talking about it today, but one of the things that we were speaking about is some of the understanding now, or the idea that what left North America open for European settlement was a horrible plague that wiped out about 90% of the Americas before the first Europeans got here. So these things are hugely impactful throughout history. Yeah. So tell us more.
So before we go any further, David said something. Imagine living in that city. Imagine those homes. To me, that's the most interesting part of thinking for me about the Black Plague.
Sure.
What was it like to live back then, actually? And of course, I don't know, but I can try to role play and figure it out. So I want to talk to you guys about that. Like, yeah, that's what I want to hear.
It is fascinating because we could talk all about the facts, and there are some very interesting historical things that happen, and we'll get into that. And there's also some science behind it that we haven't really talked about yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like that because let's start off thinking. Right now, we live in Denver, okay?
Right.
And can you imagine if your neighbors, the people you work with, your friends, all of a sudden were getting a disease where they felt sick on Monday, and by Thursday, they were gone,
Yeah.
And you said that happened to what, like 50% of the population? Close to
It's
it?
a good question, and it was very different in some different cities and some different towns. Some places were barely affected. In some places up to maybe around 70% were killed. I think on average, you could say probably about half was a decent thing to go by.
So like half the people I know and interact with would be
Right.
gone within a couple weeks.
Yeah. And where do you, can you hold funeral services for that many people? Are you even able to process that? Our modern understanding of trauma and grief is that for one person who's close to you, if they pass, it's going to take you a while to return to a sort of normal, whatever that means, state, but at least to get over it, to process it, to do the grieving.
Right.
If you lose that many people that are important to you, what does that even do to your psyche going forward?
Yeah, and you're just talking about individually, that's what we're going through, right? But as a city and, society, right? What happens? I'm seeing all kinds of looting, like all kinds of crazy stuff. That's complete, end of days type, things happening, right? They're probably gonna have to call in the military.
They don't have a military.
Oh, wait.
Half of them are gone.
That's right.
It's
There are
not
people
looting.
too.
It's just free stuff.
Right.
It's true. You think about it, because we're calling the military. Military is just as affected as everybody else, right?
They're people too, right?
And,
Wow.
and it's fascinating because one of the effects of the plague, we were talking about this just a second ago, is, man, when something like that happens, people look for somebody to blame. And especially, like now, at least there's some understanding of germs. But I guarantee you, if a new germ showed up, they'd be like, it was brought by these people over here. They brought this germ, right? There's always this idea that we need to find somebody to blame. And in the Middle Ages, it was, subgroups like the indigenous peoples of regions, the Jewish populations of regions, the
church.
Well, right. Yeah. They had to find somebody, and maybe it was the sinners. And there's this interesting little side note, the cats, right? So there is some debate as to whether the plague was caused by rats, because this idea was that the rats carried the lice, and the lice or the fleas and stuff like put on humans and blah, blah, blah. But later on, they noticed, see, all of our science comes from later plagues that happened, much less dangerous because of more modern science. So we look back and we noticed that rats did play a role in those, but there was a huge rat die-off. There's no report of a huge rat die-off. Plus, the way that it spread, like 8 miles a day sometimes. Incredible. But there's this theory, it's kind of interesting. These myths grow up, especially after 600 years. So one of the popes, I believe his name was Justinian number something, like 10, 11, talked about how cats were used in rituals of Satanists. And so cats were not welcome. So cats were slaughtered, killed, not welcome in homes. Therefore, rats, mice. And then that's what led to the Black Plague. Now, we don't really know if that's true, but that's what I'm talking about. Things need to be explained. People need to explain these things, and that would happen to us. If this happened in Denver tomorrow, I guarantee you there'd be some group who was not powerful and able to speak for themselves that would sort of take the blame, right?
Perhaps the population of our neighbors without homes would be an easy target, because who's going to, go to bat for them? Of course, we have, people like our friend, Quica Montoya, who would definitely, take up the mantle of doing that. But I don't see how that wouldn't be who, we just decide to point our finger at, because it's easy. It's like, oh, no, you.
Yeah. The gentleman over there that's unhoused, that maybe hasn't had access to a washroom, all these things. Yeah, it would happen. And it's so interesting to think about how modern society would operate, right? What we do have is the advantage of some science, right? So science has come a long way. And that's why we haven't had the plague in North America, right? At least since what might have happened before European settlers, because the science has become so advanced. So now the plague only kills about 10 to 11. It still exists in the world.
Yes, it does.
It's in this neck of the woods, too. It's generally California and the southwestern states where the deaths are.
Yeah, but it's only like an 11% death rate as opposed to like 94 back then, It's super interesting. And then it's kind of funny because I don't know how many of our listeners are, into some alternative history explanations, but there's a very popular History Channel show called Ancient Aliens.
Right.
And they posit that, of course, their whole explanation for a lot of prehistory is that, aliens came from somewhere else, created the human race, and then occasionally they would cull it, much like if we were breeding horses, we might occasionally decide that these horses weren't good enough to breed, those kinds of things, right? And so the idea is maybe because, there's these population centers like Milan, right, who never were hit. And so people search for explanation. And in that search for meaning, it may be outside the bounds of what a lot of people accept as rational. Nevertheless, somebody thought enough of it to put the money to create an hour-long show that airs on a premium, or not premium, but at least a cable channel. And so the idea is that maybe the plagues throughout history have been a way for these alien overlords to cull the herd, right?
And there have been some effects that have happened to especially the European population, at least as far as I'm aware of, that have been fairly positive as a result of the plague.
Interesting.
Let me see if I can remember this right. 10% of people before the plague lived to be past 70. And a few years after the plague ended, that number skyrocketed to 20%.
Really?
Past 70. As well as they've done some genetic testing, right, from, bones and all that stuff. And they're able to see that. Let me see if I can pull up a specific note that I have. Basically, the immune system of these people that survive this are improved. It's better. And that they live longer and healthier lives.
Wow.
There's also a rather interesting thing when you talk about, culling a population, that this was one of the factors that increased the IQ among that population, like during that time.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of basic evolutionary theory, that at the end of the day,
Well,
those
true.
that survive for whatever reason have the ability to survive
That's absolutely true. Yeah, you don't really need the whole idea of the aliens about that. Just people who survive stressful or, like things, they're just naturally more fit. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting.
And it goes like, so, right, one like way that IQ shows up, right, is like planning, taking things that are important, realizing what's not important. That's also kind of like executive cognitive functioning, but just like getting a game plan. What do you do when this comes into your city and the first boat arrives and the whole crew's dead?
Right.
Or you see that whole block die. You need a game plan, right? And like, who do you trust? Or like, do you change your habits or not? Are you eating different things, drinking different things? Are you letting anyone into your house? Are you interacting with anyone? Are you even leaving your house?
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I think that there's probably something to be said for like the people that had like the plan are able to adjust like their day-to-day, second-to-second decisions based upon like what their neighbors and their sickly neighbors were doing, were able to survive.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the first modern quarantine happened, as far as we know, around this time period. And it was some of the cities that were spared. I mean, we talk about it as being mysterious, right?
Yes.
But it very well could have been, and most likely was, the planning and the foresight of the leaders of these cities. I know especially one of them was Ragusa. I believe I'm saying that correctly. Who they had like, okay, so if you were new and you're coming in again, remember there's no modern transportation and the time periods that things happened much slower. So they were able to say to people like, okay, so you're coming new to our city, fine. You're going to spend 2 months outside the city in these things that we've set up to make sure that the sick people, you're going to get sick within these 60 days and you're not coming in until then. And if a section of the city did get sick, they were like, okay, well, you can't leave. And these methods, right, would lead to leaving the people that were smart enough and able enough to take these measures as being the ones that lived, right?
Incredible.
And so, of course, then their kids would be that. And then also the more biologically, sound, right?
Yeah.
Would have been able to maybe fight off the plague, and those that couldn't, wouldn't.
Milan was another one of those cities, right? That supposedly there was only one family, there was one household that died.
Right.
And I think right after that, supposedly they quarantined them or that area. And there was a few things I was reading up on that like the city of Milan did. So obviously they like barred entrance into their city. Whoever left, whoever came, was clearly very closely monitored. They implemented basically like a passport system, but it was almost like where are you from? And we need to know that where you're coming from hasn't been hit by the plague yet. And so they had a network of spies that were like stationed and were like, oh, that city's okay. Or like that one's hit hard. And they would know to not take people in from those certain cities.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Smart.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, that's just some good planning.
Yeah. Terrifying though, right? To go back to the whole like mass hysteria thing. We talked about how, blaming people and stuff like that. One of the theories back in the day of how the plague was spread, when I say back in the day, during that time, it's known now as miasma, but basically the air is bad.
Right.
Yeah.
So the thing to blame is the air.
Huh.
And imagine how scary that is, man. What you're breathing is just going to turn you into this, zombie that's going to die in 4 days or 7 days, and you're going to have these black pussy wounds opening on you.
Right? Yeah. Which kind of leads us into the discussion because there are 3 different types of plague. So we hear bubonic plague, but that's just one of them, right? So there's pneumonic, right? So the pneumonic plague is actually, it is the air, right? So it's spread through the lungs, through the coughing of somebody who's infected. And like, that's the one that knocks you out in like 4 days, right? That's the worst one to get. And because it's spread through somebody coughing, and again, people didn't know, like, it's so interesting because we hear air and we think, oh, the infected air. But see, their concept of infection wasn't around.
Yeah.
So it's like the air. So they weren't making any difference between me being like 2 inches from your face and me being 5 feet across the room, which we would do now.
Yeah. Was there a dirty air part of town?
Yeah, exactly. Right? A dirty air part of town. And then who lived there, and those people got to go. Right?
Yeah.
Man, that's scary. So the bubonic plague, though, was a little bit different. You would get it in the lymph nodes, right? And then the septemic plague I believe I'm saying that correctly, is in the blood. Right?
Septicemic.
Septicemic. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
I appreciate that.
Septicemia, yeah.
Yes.
In the blood.
You know, and so these were the major forms of the plague, and the pneumonic, is my understanding, was the deadliest, of course, because it did come through infected air. I imagine much like tuberculosis is today, right? Where, you know, if you're infected, if you're talking super close to somebody, like that's the way you get in.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is fascinating how disease spreads.
Now,
But
is it the disease actually just, you know, kind of transferring through the air, or is it more of micro, like, you know, phlegm and like fluids, right, from your system that are making their way through the air into your system?
My understanding would be that the Y. pestis, that bacterium,
Right.
if I have the pneumonic version and my lungs are sick,
Right.
then these guys are literally growing in my lungs.
Right.
And so when I cough, when I speak, little particles of, you know, whatever phlegm or
Saliva,
Whatever.
whatever it is. So, okay.
exactly, it carries that, and
Like a mist,
you
right?
get
Something-
inoculated by that.
yeah. Wow.
And you know, I think that, so I have this image of the plague doctors, man. It's,
Yeah.
you know, it's almost Halloween, man. And there's those costumes that are available. Actually, because when I was getting ready for this episode, I thought to myself, maybe that's what I should be for Halloween. But I just think that
cool.
the imagery, it's so cool, right?
Yeah.
You know, this guy with these, like, you know, freaking glasses on or whatever, like, who came up with like this whole costume? It looked really, really cool, like way too put together. It doesn't seem like something that was put together for, you know, just protection. It wasn't just function, right? There's a form factor to
Yeah.
it.
There
right?
definitely is.
And so I was reading up on these guys, and it turns out that they weren't actually like, they weren't the most revered and doctors that were looked at as being the people with the most experience, right? A lot of times they were kind of like, you know, I won't say like they were quacks or anything, but they were the guys who were looking to just, and I think that speaks to like how they were dressed, because part of it was a show. And because they didn't have as many, you know, clients, and they weren't seen to be as professional or knowledgeable, right, and effective, this was their chance to actually, like, you know, gain some notoriety. And so they came out the woodworks, and they had these, you know, this getup on, and of course, you know, the beak had all of these like herbs and all these sweet smelling things in it.
Wow.
To like block, you know, try and block some of that bad air.
Wow.
From getting to them, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, when I saw that, and I thought to myself, you know what? Gas masks, okay?
Yeah.
Modern gas masks. There's nothing, okay, yeah, we do kind of look at them and like, oh, that's kind of cool, right? But it doesn't have the same effect as this, you know, this costume this guy's wearing. There's a lot of, like, you know, show there. You know,
Yeah.
it's pretty mysterious and kind of like, I mean, I think it's like really cool.
Yeah. Well, and again, you know, they believed in a much different way of how the world works. And
Right.
so evil spirits that could be scared off by your appearance,
Right.
were a real thing to them.
Exactly. So yeah,
know?
so yeah.
And
Yeah,
what-
so actually, yeah. So maybe it wasn't like, you know, it wasn't meant to have that effect of, oh man, look at this, look at it's kind of cool or whatever. Maybe it is just supposed to ward off, you know, evil spirits.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too that unknowingly it probably helped a lot of those people survive, because
Agreed.
if the lung, you know, was the thing, and you're wearing this long beak-like mask, and it wouldn't matter what you put in there, but just anything to prevent those small bacteria from getting to you
Right.
probably helped, right?
Even
Yeah,
just the
absolutely.
mask was probably helpful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
imagine the smell too, though. Of
Yeah.
course, that's
Oh,
why
yeah.
they packed it with all kinds of herbs and like sweet smelling, you know.
Well, and that's
things.
one of the things like we talked about. If it did hit, let's say if your city is experiencing a death rate of thousands upon thousands a day,
A day.
you are going to have to resort to, we would have to do it, right? Because we can't leave just dead bodies lying in giant heaps, because we know that that's going to spread disease even more, right? And although they didn't quite understand that, the same thing happened where they're like, okay, we got to get rid of these bodies. And so all we can do is put them in giant piles and burn them. And so can you imagine just the smell of that? So not only,
Ew.
especially the Middle Ages, where So now we have a very firm understanding that you cannot walk around in excrement, right? You can't have animal excrement or human excrement anywhere near where you live. They just didn't know that. So the cities smelled, people smelled, burning things. I mean, I would imagine that it was a relief to put on that mask.
Yeah.
You still have that in certain third world countries today, that people don't have the education that you're not supposed to have excrement near where you live or near water sources either.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the main sources of, what is it, cholera, I believe?
A whole bunch of things.
A whole bunch of things, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just bad for you. Yeah. It's so interesting that modern science, as we understand it, as we live in a first world country, common knowledge, right? But if you don't grow up with that, it's not like it's just inborn. The whole system that we have set up for at least basic education, and we talked about that when we did the battlefield medicine one, was that a lot of the stuff that you learn in 8th grade science class was world revolution or revolutionary when it was first understood. Like germ theory, something that all kids, you just grow up knowing in a first world nation because of our structure. You're just not going to know if you live in a society that's sort of outside of that educational structure. And imparting that knowledge is a lot of what people do when they go there and they do things for these cultures, is to explain this to them. And imagine being able to go back in time and explain it to them. Like, hey, if you guys will put masks on the people that are coughing, would have been way more effective than everybody else walking around with masks, and we would know that now, but they didn't know it then. And it's just fascinating how history has come up, since, just the idea of, people gaining knowledge. Again, before the show, and our listeners will know this, the idea of the guy who realized that pouring boiling oil on a gunshot wound, not a good idea. Just being intelligent enough, this is before the scientific method became a thing, but he was able to recognize, this thing that I'm doing isn't working, this thing is. And how much of that grew during time periods of great stress.
And that would be difficult to realize that when all the authority figures,
right?
Everyone, it's just known that's what you do to treat, that gunshot wound.
Right, yeah.
It's so difficult to go against the grain, even today.
Yeah, even today. Paradigm shift, right?
Yeah.
This is interesting because any anomaly that fits outside of the current structure of what's believed to be scientifically accurate is a lot of times just not even paid attention to. Yeah. So another doctor being a different term, it was funny they had the term surgeon barber, right?
Yes.
Which not something you hear anymore.
Barber shop, right? Where they also performed surgeries.
Yeah.
And so you knew that you could either go there to get your hair cut or perhaps have your wisdom teeth pulled.
Yeah.
Or something.
Also,
you're already in the chair. Why not?
Exactly, yeah.
Would you also like a shave?
Yeah.
I'll be sure to use the different scalpel that I opened up your kidneys with.
Yes. Which leads me, our first sponsor is Dr. Owen's Barbershop and Surgery. Come on in, get an appendectomy and a shave. Have a special this week on bleedings.
Bloodletting.
Bloodletting.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, it's amazing how it's funny for us, but for them, very real.
Yeah, absolutely. Since you brought up bloodletting, the plague doctors actually use bloodletting as one of the methods for treating Black Plague victims. Okay. Now, so bloodletting is one of the other things. The other remedy they used was putting frogs or leeches on the buboes. Is that how that's pronounced?
Yeah. I think, like bubonic stands for
right.
The lymph nodes would swell up and you get these spores.
Right. So putting frogs or leeches on the buboes. Also, specifically to balance the humors. Okay.
Well, of course, yeah. You balance the humors. I know I spend a good part of my day,
balancing the humors.
Yeah.
If you're not starting your day that way, you're not maximizing your time.
Absolutely. Now, balancing the humors, is that like sarcastic jokes versus... is that how that...
No. So we actually tried to look up exactly what they mean when they say the humors. Mm-hmm. And there was quite a elaborate explanation of what... So it just says humorism, or humoralism was a system of medicine detailing the makeup and workings of the human body adopted by ancient Greek and Roman physicians and philosophers.
Interesting.
Right.
So it was like the spirit of the body? Is that what I'm thinking?
You know, I honestly, I couldn't tell you exactly what that really looks like. That's just the explanation they gave here.
That's fascinating, though.
Because I think the lens, you know, from which these people were viewing things, right? There was so much superstition and like everything was so intertwined, right? Spirit, body. And so the way they describe things sometimes it makes it hard to like for us to
it is
figure
true
out today because we don't see things the same way. Everything is so kind of compartmentalized. Like, okay, cool. This is this, you know, mind, body, spirit, whatever. Everything's separate.
Yes.
But it was all
one thing back then. Again, back to like the surgeon barber. And, you know, when we talk about the sciences, we're talking about different sciences. For them, it wasn't a thing. And I know you had mentioned this earlier. Tell us about how the hospital came about during this time period.
Sure. So definitely not an expert in this matter, but hospitals evolved as a result of the Black Plague. So before this time, hospitals were interesting places. There was a conglomeration of a lot of stuff going on. A lot of people that worked there were religious. Some of them like were very strongly associated with churches. Some like the functions they served were treating people in poverty, but not only in terms of healthcare, but in terms of like, you know, speaking them, you know, the religious word and, you know, food and all those sort of things. And it was just kind of like a gathering place. And over this time, as the plague developed, right, a large amount of people were sick. And so they went to the hospital for treatment. And there was a huge amount of people that were sick that needed to stay in the hospital and receive treatment at the hospital. And so the hospital kind of became a place for ill people to go and receive treatment. And some of the things like feeding of others and kind of a community gathering place, it ceased to become those things. And perfect little segue too. I'm going to go back to what you guys were just talking about. And Adrian, like with the humors, right? And I don't know what they are, right? But we've all heard things like, you have the three humors, and then one of them is the balance of this and this, or the second one is the balance of, you know, this and this, and so we're going to bloodlet you or something and like rebalance one of the binaries or whatever, the dualities of your humors. Obviously, I don't know if that's how it worked, but you guys get the drift, right?
Yeah. Right.
Medicine ceased to like use as much of that theory-based thinking after the Black Plague. We had religious people, we had politicians, we had different types of medical practitioners trying to treat people that had the plague. And really none of them were very successful. And so they analyzed that. Why couldn't we do this? Like obviously the bloodletting didn't work, or obviously this didn't work.
Right.
And so it became to be more evidence-based instead of theory-based.
Right, like it ought to work this way because of this theory I have, as opposed to, well, I'm looking at this and determining what's working from the actual looking, not from building the theory from the evidence, as opposed to the other way.
Exactly.
Which is basically how our modern science works.
Exactly.
When it works effectively.
Exactly.
Huh. That's fascinating.
Yeah. It also must have been some formation of a communication network that was able to happen.
Right.
So that if somebody came up with some way to treat a disease or whatever it was, they were able to share that with the rest of the medical community, whatever that was at that point.
Sure. Which I'm sure would have taken place through the hospital.
Huh. And universities started to teach more actual medicine instead of like, here's this weird philosophy that is all encompassing for all of life, including medicine. Medicine started to be taught, you know, surgeries and that kind of stuff. So I think that the universities would have been a place too.
Yeah, that's interesting because that did happen a lot. I know I studied philosophy in college, and you had all these systems that these guys would come up with, like, this is the entire universe summed up in my book.
Yes.
And then what that means is that all these other things should fit into that. And they usually didn't, right? In fact, if they had, I think we'd all be following like one thing right now. Be like, yeah, it got figured out in 1450. We've been using it since then, right? World's been great. And that's not how it's been.
Absolutely. So I want to pose a question to a few of you guys. We've already touched upon it. I want to ask David and Adrian more of this. We're just because we've talked more, you know what I'm saying?
Sure.
So I want to get them involved a little bit.
Yeah.
Back to this idea of role playing.
Okay.
And after some of the things we've talked about, Aaron and I came in and did a little more research than you guys did by design, right?
Yes.
And so I want to see what you guys think about the Black Plague now. So I guess I have one question that I'll start with. What do you think you would do if Denver right now did that?
It's a good one.
So you just want us to, role play. And so we're in this city. The plague is affecting, the inhabitants. What do we do?
Yeah.
My gut reaction is grab a bunch of food and drive.
Okay.
No, I'm serious. Like, drive to Canada, drive to the mountains, get away from people.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think similar thinking, maybe not immediately, that, because I'd probably be like, so very similar, right? Gather some supplies and put into action my exit plan, right? Because I actually have one. No, if there was like something serious going on, where do I go? If I have family, like, my immediate family, where do we try and meet up? Communication. Like, I think about these things. Not because, I'm a conspiracy theorist or whatever, or prepper or whatever. I just have, grown to appreciate that kind of thing. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's what I would do. But given the education that we've gotten today, oh man, I mean, I live in a communal, building, right? So
Me too.
yeah. So yeah, that would be like really tough. I mean, so here's the thing. Do we know as much as we do after this episode, in that moment? Because if we do, then I'm trying to figure out what do I have in house, right? Or in my room or whatever. Like, I'm looking at supplies. What can I use to survive in here? Because I don't want to get out because of the uncertainty of what that would entail.
Yeah. And so you got it right. It's a 2-part question. I'm not going to tell you what part 2 is. I'm waiting to drop that on you guys. But
Okay.
Part 1 is given what you know now, given our discussion, and as well as just what two intelligent people, just like in today's society, what you know about, washing your hands and navigating today's world with today's knowledge. I want to hear a little bit about that. And the next question, part 2, is the most important one. So if you don't feel like you can elaborate at length on the first part,
Right.
that's fine.
You want to go first?
Wait, so what was the question?
It just basically, if it happens in Denver today.
Oh, okay.
You guys already answered it.
Right. So my gut would say to run, but then there's this psychological element that I'd got to think about. Like, there are people in this world and around me that I care about. So while my initial reaction might be to just run and fend for myself, I probably would try to find a way to help people. And that's where the kind of logical aspect would go in. Like, all right, what do I know? What's the best way for me to kind of keep myself safe? How can I help other people stay safe? That type of thing.
Cool.
Yeah, I think very similar. I definitely err on the side of immediately I'd think about like how much information what do I know? I think that would be a big part, right? Because then that informs my next move. Obviously we have technology today. Back then it was a totally different thing. Some dude would have to come on a horse or some shit like that would have to happen. But now I can just turn on the TV. Maybe I slept in that day. Everything is going to shit outside, right? But I wake up and for whatever reason, I look at my phone, right? And they're like, do you live in Denver? Good luck. This is what's going on, right? And so then from there, I'm like, first off, immediate panic, right?
Yeah.
But then then my instinct, kicks in. One of the crazy things about me, is, I've really been through the ringer in life, right? And so I always explain to people that the reason why I do my job well is because when things are on fire around me, I don't react like other people do. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, initially a little bit of panic and then like, okay, we don't have time for this.
That's your
Bring
sweet
it in.
spot. Like,
exactly.
yeah.
And then it becomes, let's bring this in. How do we survive? Because again, from the lifestyle that I used to live, survival was like, you just kick into that mode and you're like, okay, what do we do to like preserve or get what we need? And so lucky for us, we've got Google and all this information. So on the news, if I'm lucky enough that they say, oh, it's a pneumonic plague or it's this type of plague, right? immediately I'm like, okay, cool. So what's that about? And then that informs my next move, because here's the thing. If there's some kind of plague, I already know, I've watched enough movies and things, even if I'm not that educated, to know that maybe I shouldn't just like go and blend into, you know, the society out there, right? Let's figure out what's going on before I make my next move. And then, so yeah, if I find out, you know, some more specifics, then I kick into some kind of plan, right?
So you guys made a few really good points, and I'm going to go off how you just answered and go into part two. So you guys each mentioned a few things, right? David mentioned transportation, right? Wanting to get out of here, as well as like that duty to yourself, but the people you love, and like, do I help myself? Do I help them? Can I do both? Do I put one over the other? What about my loved ones, right? That's like a serious question.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you, Adrian, you brought up quite a few points as well. You talked about technology. You talked about gathering your gear, which could be a whole lot of things, from tents to a raincoat to good shoes to a water bottle, and all sorts of other things too. To
My Nike Zooms.
get the Matty boosts. And to technology, to just information. Right. And so there's even more stuff that I'm sure we're forgetting, that like we're assuming other people in previous times have had and they haven't, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that you guys just mentioned and some serious questions there. So we're going to still say we're in Denver. I mean, what are you going to do if you see someone that says they're sick and they ask for your help? What do you think you would do? And they're not someone you know right now, but they come up, they give you some distance because they also know that they don't want to freak you out. They stay 10, 15 feet away. They're screaming like really loud, like, I need some help, you know? What do you do in a situation like that?
Once again, I think information is key here, right? So how much information was I able to gather before I decided to like venture out?
Okay.
I'm guessing, just for myself, if I've decided to venture out, I've either done so because I don't think I can survive isolated, right? And I'm going to have to go out anyway. Or I've determined that it's safer, it's not, damning, or it's not, fatal to leave, you know, wherever I'm at.
Okay.
Because say it's, septicemic, right? Versus, pneumonic, right? Mm-hmm. And so in that case, if I have that information, then I start thinking about, okay, fine, based on what the information I collected, how can I help this person? And so I would definitely be down to figure that out, because if we go back to like self-preservation, if I can figure out how to help this person, then there's two of us, right? That can do the same thing for someone else. And then we can grow a group of people that can help us, you know, survive, right?
Sure.
And we're helping other people. So I think that would be just, you know, obviously, I'm in a safe place right now to say that. Who knows what I'd do in the moment? But, you know, in this scenario, I think that's what I'd do.
Cool. So let's go to the next like part of that. And David, go for it. Maybe this one isn't going to be so much of a question, but more of a discussion for all of us. Like, you're in your place. You're in your childhood home. I mean, I know that's like not here in Denver, right? New Jersey, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's say you're there. You're with your family and that happens. Or we're here with our families or whatever, right? Someone gets sick in your family. Just imagine, let's talk about like some of the issues that would come with that. We decided to stay in our house as a family. We're going to ride it out. We don't know, like all the details, whatever, but like we're going to ride it out as a family. And so, you know, mom gets that room. That's the sick room or whatever, right? Like, let's talk about that.
Right.
Yeah, that'd be really hard. 'Cause like I could think about it logically right now, but in each and every situation, there'd be so many factors at play. Like you were talking about checking the news. If we were dealing with a situation similar to the Black Plague, like they had then, I wouldn't trust the news. Meaning every station would have their own idea of what they think is going on, when in reality, this is probably something we've never seen to this extent. So I guess in an ideal world, I'd find a hazmat suit, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And like, I think that would be the best protection I'm aware of. And I think it would be smart if I was with my family or if I was with someone that got sick to, have like a quarantine room.
And it'd be difficult to set up in today's world. If we have plastic sheets and we have tarps and duct tape, it'd be difficult to set something like that up now.
Yeah.
And we even know what a quarantine is.
Right. Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And so like I see some issues arising that like are potentially really difficult to deal with. Let's say, I'm hanging out with someone I love and they have a cold. Sometimes I make the choice to not care and I kiss them anyway. What if that happens? Right. And I think there's so many little things that like it'd be really easy for me to get sick or quote unquote by the book. I wouldn't do right. I didn't wash my hands one time before I eat a meal. Being honest, I probably don't wash my hands before more than half of my meals. I'm not happy about that, but it's probably the truth. In my life, that's certainly the case. As well as, just sharing a hug or sharing a space.
Right.
What if we have the same air conditioning and like some of it's recirculating?
Right.
There's all sorts of different components to that where like it'd be difficult to keep someone that lives close to me and like healthy and me try to treat them without me getting sick.
Absolutely.
And so, like, I guess I kind of just want to extend the question further. And it doesn't so much need to be, like a, hey, Owen versus you two. Like, I'm going to throw, like, Dungeons and Dragons situations. And, like, I'm going to role play and be the DM. And you need to, like, live in the world I create. But, like, the point of that is, like, I want to have a discussion about, like, what are some of the issues that we'd run into today? And then ultimately try to backtrack into, like, the 1300s when this was going on. Mm-hmm. Let's try to put ourselves back there. What would those issues be like then, man? And how difficult and scary would it be to survive in that time? And there's been some people that I've read about that have had very interesting responses to the Black Plague. Socially, there were some things that we might not think of. So I'm going to bring those up later. But I just want to have a discussion with everyone, all of us here.
Yeah.
Just about that.
You know what it makes me think of, right? I don't know if anybody here has seen it. It's a small movie. You know who David Cross is? Sure.
I've heard his name.
He's a comedian. He was if you looked him up, you'd probably recognize him. But this movie takes place in Los Angeles and there's an attack. It's not a plague type situation, but it's a situation where there's been some kind of weaponized virus released into the air. And it's this dinner party that they always have, or like a brunch party. Every Sunday, this group of friends meet and some of them are there and some of them are still yet to get there. And they realize what's happened. It's on the news. They're like, oh my God, we can't let anybody in. And then some of the people who weren't there show up and they have to make this decision. Do we let these people in or do we not? And I won't tell you how it ends, but it would be that type of thing. Like this is the situation you're saying. Your buddy might be on the way over, right? And all this news hits and you've been protected. You've been inside. And he's outside. Mm-hmm. What are you going to do, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know that any of us can truly answer that until we're in this situation.
Yeah.
But I suspect that the instinct, and this is why atrocities happen in times like this, right? Mm-hmm. Because that instinct for self-preservation kicks in above all else. And so even within a family, even people you care about, when people start facing the abyss, decisions get real. And would you be like, I can't let him in. Can't let Joe in. Joe's my best friend for 20 years. But if I let Joe in, I die. Probably not letting Joe in.
Yeah.
And it's harsh to say. And these are the realities these people were living with. And we're even armed with some of this knowledge. And it's kind of curious because I wonder, it might even be easier to deal with when you're like, it's evil spirits, right? So I'm going to go ahead and let Joe in. We're going to perform some ceremonies. I'm going to light some candles. We're going to say the magic prayers. We'll be all right.
You're right.
You know?
I'm going to burn some sage, man.
Yeah.
Start there.
It's a good point. There was people that flagellate themselves, right?
Like that was one of the things I read about. Yeah.
I don't want to call it self-harm, but I guess that's what
it's
it is,
exactly
right?
What it was,
and it's, it's like a repentance for sin.
Yes.
A lot of them were upping their routine and like they were like very certain that it was because it was God sending down punishment for the sins of the world. Yeah. And they would flagellate, giving them open wounds and spreading blood to try to repent for their sins and the sins of others so that like this damnation would stop.
And they would go to the cities where it was happening to do it because that's how they figured it would help. And then they're, as we know it now, doing the exact wrong thing, right?
And what a beautiful sentiment in some ways, though.
Sure.
Like to go there and like inflict you with some bodily harm.
Yeah,
absolutely. Very selfless.
Exactly.
Right.
Interesting.
It seems like in really stressful times and when you're in that fight or flight type of situation, you rely on all the knowledge you have and all of the traditions and instincts that you have. It's not the time to start kind of thinking big picture and scientifically. It's like if somebody is deeply religious, they run to their religion, their God, you know?
Right.
If someone believes that if by harming themselves, God will help others, and that's something they keep doing more, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I made a comment when we're off air, right? That this whole idea of me arming myself with information in many ways will really just be about self-soothing, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I wouldn't want the information. Like my immediate reaction is like, oh, screw the media. They don't know what's going on. I would just be like, shut everything off. I don't care what's going on. I need to find a way to protect myself, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah. So it's interesting. Everyone has a different idea of what is going to be the best thing to do immediately, right? I mean, I think it's a response. You don't know what you're going to do, but in that second, you just kick on, and that in many ways is so revealing, you know, to you, right? Like in hindsight, like if you ever go through an event, and we probably have, right? You go back and you look, and here it is, like the purest form of like, you know, who this person is, like at least part of that, right? Seeping through, and, you know, so you're really informed.
Like your belief systems.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think you made an excellent point, right? We would automatically go back to what is our core, our belief system. And we've each sort of outlined, you know, what it is. And it's interesting because we know that's what we would do. Because, you know, those guys, I have friends, I'm sure we all have friends who have like the go bag. And they're ready. Yeah. Like they got a plan. They're going to the mountains. I got a bag with this and that. And then other people are like, you know, I'm just going to write it out and see, you know, because if society's going down, I'm going down. I don't have the illusion that I can actually survive by myself in the mountains.
Right.
It's very fascinating what happens when human beings are under stress. And I think the Black Plague presents us with this very real situation that actually happened. Right. So we can look back and see it's some of the social consequences that happen as a result, and look at how human beings certainly acted. And it's fascinating to me because that's how philosophy is founded. Because a lot of our laws and a lot of the way we construct our society is based on how we believe human beings operate under duress and stress. Right.
Right.
And do you believe that the human being reacts well in times of lawlessness, or do you believe that in times of great stress, that's when human beings act the worst, and then you construct your society and your police and your laws to reflect that?
That's a very interesting point. In a sense, too, this whole discussion, it reminds me of why history is cool.
Yeah.
Why people's personal experience and like collective history are beautiful and like very illuminating to me, to you, to us.
Right.
And legally, there were some big changes that started to occur as a result of the Black Plague. One of these was women started having homeowner rights, or I guess I should say landowner rights, that previously they didn't have. And we can't say it wasn't one, like this exactly directed this, because some of that movement and that discussion, you know, and for equity was already being discussed.
Right.
But a lot of men were dead. What do you do with all the family land, right?
Sure.
A lot of women were like, you know, allowed to keep, you know, their family's land. And some of them were, even if they married in the future, were allowed to keep that. And it wasn't, quote unquote, taken from them or returned to the husband's family.
Interesting.
Right. So there was some pretty interesting stuff with that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
there's a story like that in the Old Testament. A family of all female children, and they were asking, like, what do we do with our father's plot of land? You know? Because it's the same thing. Usually it would be passed down to the son, but there's no boys as children, so what do you do there?
Yeah.
Wow.
This is fascinating how that works. And I know, too, how, like, the serfs, because at this time, you know, there wasn't like there is now where there's just people that earned wages and people that own property. You were pretty much either of the noble class who owned the land, or you were a serf. And a serf was actually not quite a slave in the sense that we think of slavery that's happened on this continent in the last few hundred years, but they were like corn. They were part of the land that they lived on, right? Well, this changed a little bit because as the workforce to bring in the crops dwindled, the serfs were actually able to demand more rights, you know, And it was kind of the beginning of the process that, you know, ends in the Magna Carta, which is really not about the serfs, but that began that process. And of course, industrialization throughout Europe leads to a rise in the working class, and, you know, serfs get their freedom later on. But it's fascinating, right? Even now, like, think about it. The modern era of women's rights in America begins with a discussion about suffrage, and it begins with the idea of equality. But it really takes off when all the men are called off to fight in World War II, right? And that's when the modern women movement really came to the fore, because it was necessary for society.
A lot of times we're more reactionary than proactive.
Yes.
So when a situation demands we deal with something, that's usually when we start to deal with it.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely true on that
As
one.
much as we'd like to fool ourselves.
Right.
But sometimes you can't know what you don't know you don't know. You know,
Exactly.
sometimes there are things that are just outside your scope of understanding, and you don't even realize it till suddenly it comes to your attention. You're like, oh crap.
Yeah, exactly.
Have y'all heard Donald Rumsfeld's speech about that? You got to look it up, because whatever you think about Donald Rumsfeld, he was the Secretary of Defense under George Bush Jr., right? And he gives this speech that sounds like nonsense, but when you look at it, it's fascinating, and it talks about known unknowns, right? So the things you know that you don't know, and then unknown unknowns, the things you don't know that you don't know.
Yes.
Right? And it's this great speech because it makes a lot of sense. Just like you were saying, you may think you've taken accounted for the things that you don't know. Like, we don't know this over here, but then there is a whole other stuff that you don't even know that you don't know. And then it just shows up and you got to deal with it.
That's how a lot of legal proceedings go. It's like when you're facing an issue, it's like, all right, what happened in the past that we could draw on?
Sure.
Like, what cases happened in the past that we can kind of use the ruling from that to inform this? But sometimes you got to create something new because it's just never been around.
Yeah. Society is fascinating.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I love how we have been able to talk about this ancient plague, 700 years old, roughly, right? And then really realize how, even though society has changed, technology has changed, our understanding of what the world is has changed, human nature hasn't really changed. Right? It's the same. 700 years ago, next week, people generally are going to act the same.
A lot
Sweet.
of people in those times, the church ruled tons of people's lives
Yes.
with so many different ways. Financially, culturally, socially, legally. A lot of people, when the Black Plague was coming around, they decided to say, screw it. We're going to have fun. And there was quite a few cases of people basically, they're not celebrating the plague, but their ass was against the fire, and so they just let their inhibitions go.
Anarchists.
And there was tons of stories of like, I'm not so sure about that. I totally believe it, right? But there was people that would just party, just heathens, dude. Yeah, and like there was a ton of drinking, feasting, parties, like screwing around with each other.
Yeah.
And like some of the old dialogue about like what was proper or this or that was kind of out of the window. Like, well, who's to blame? Either the church or the government for all like the Black Plague. It's not us. They have the power. Why aren't they stopping it? So like here we are, and we're just going to celebrate and live our lives because we might die anyway.
Right.
And some people just kind of gave into it and started to just enjoy it. And
Yeah.
there was like quite a few stories of like pretty wild parties going on in that
I'm
time.
sure.
Roaming bands of drunk people just singing songs.
Wow. That's a great
And like,
picture.
and the plague is just like going all around. them.
The plague doctors and then just these guys partying.
Sounds very human, though. you know?
Yeah,
Like,
right?
I totally buy it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the riots in Ferguson. I heard there was a tremendous amount of looting going on, and I think it's partially that people feel like there's a free-for-all, and I'm
Yeah.
going to take advantage of it in any way I
Absolutely.
can.
Absolutely. Yeah. People react in all kinds of different ways, right? There's this idea that every time there's chaos and like, just something completely tragic going on, you can see so many different things going on, right? And then there's this image of like people like really, we start to show our our capability to be super compassionate, right? And it's always interesting because there's always that obligatory picture of, some Caucasian man holding some, like a little black kid, right? And they're both crying, right? And yes, that is absolutely an example of who we are at the core. Like, I believe that, we're not necessarily like horrible people. Sometimes, maybe we're programmed, by all kinds of different factors that, that we encounter, in day-to-day life, right? Media and whatever you're being taught at home and all this. But perhaps in these moments, right, when some of these like tragic things are happening, we tap into something that, just exists within our goodness, right? And it doesn't matter, like, nothing else matters. And that moment, it's just like, that person, like, has two arms like me. It's so pure. It has arms like me. Like, that kid looks like my kid. Like it could be my child. Like, my kid's 9 years old, like this kid. I need to save them, I just thought I would definitely, bring that up because I got that image, right? Because we're talking about all these different situations and how we would react and all of this. And yeah, there's, there's always the people looting, there's the people that are, reacting to this in all kinds of different ways. The adventurous types, okay? There's a freaking tornado. Some guy's like, I need to get closer to it.
That's so true, right?
I'm like, dude, what's wrong with you?
The dudes in the hurricanes, like, they'll be showing the hurricanes, and then
Yeah.
they'll just be like the people out walking around in it,
Dude, there's some
Yeah.
guy, I kid you not, in his flip-flops, right? There's someone like trying to like do some kind, like the news, right? The news
Yeah.
cameras here, they're like, oh my God, the winds. And then right behind them, there's some dude just kind of like walking by, man, just in a white tee, some shorts and flip-flops.
Or like people dancing, like
Like,
It's so funny.
like what's going on in these people's heads, man?
Well, that's what would happen. Like, if in that movie they talk about that, because that's sort of an exploration of human nature in that movie
Yeah.
that I mentioned earlier. And yeah, a few of them are just like, hey, so me and so we're gonna go upstairs and we're gonna do this, because why not?
Right.
And that's how a lot of people would react. Some people would flip out and start looting. Some people would just be like, hey, let's have a giant party,
Right.
because who knows what's happening tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely.
it's comforting to know that there are different kinds of people that react in different ways, and not all of them are terrible.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's true.
Yes.
Some people are like, all right, let's seize this moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some people are more called to help. So I'm sure that even though there would be a large portion of people or a certain portion of people that would react negatively, I bet there would be those that are just naturally that way, that would form new communities, that would form new ways of helping people, that would overcome whatever had broken down to forge whatever they could out of what was left. And I think that is the inspiring part of human nature, because it tends to be what happens.
It makes me think too about how technology might influence something today. And I think potentially what's really beautiful about, social media is, in a perfect world, or in a very imperfect world rather, like, heroic stories can be told.
Yeah.
And in times of need, like, people latch on to those ideas, those purposes, those people, those movements. And I think there's a good chance if something very intense happened in the United States, whether it's, anything from something that's not going to happen, like a zombie apocalypse, to something that could happen, like a World War III, or like a pandemic of some kind.
Right.
Social media would be hugely influential in that process. And we already see that in the world.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Right? We've all seen the Buddhist monk, right, who like lit himself on fire. And we've seen all the different, WhatsApp and Facebook being used throughout the world for, peoples and movements to prosper and fight for things and fight against things.
That's awesome.
It would be very interesting to see in a disaster scenario like this, like the Black Plague in today's time, how the internet would influence that.
Yeah. Maybe be a force for real good.
Yeah, exactly. I think that it really could.
Yeah,
And
it
you
has
guys talk-
potential for all kinds of things, especially because it still exists as it was meant to, way back then, right? There's some people that want to take control of the internet because of how powerful it is, but thus far they haven't been able to. And I really, really think that is a great thing. And, for good or bad, the way it exists right now, at least it allows everyone an equal like opportunity to use it for whatever.
Exactly. And that's true
Instead of
freedom.
just being focused for one, use.
Because it's so interesting. One of the main proponents of an unregulated or a deregulated or as loosely regulated society as possible is because when we tend to think, I've got the answer, my way is the only way, let me institute this and do it, it's the unknown, unknowns that show up, and it ends up becoming a perversion. So it's like the internet is a perfect microcosm of just human nature. Yes, some people use the dark web for some horrible stuff, right? But it's also a backdoor channel for people who are trying to affect real social change amongst governments that are oppressive and who are killing their people to operate, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it represents the good and the bad. And like you said, I don't want to see it regulated, or I don't want to see society clamp down so much that we eliminate all the evil, because then you eliminate creativity, and then you eliminate that area where humankind can grow and learn in trying to make the perfect society. And I think that's, even though I tend to fall on the spectrum of a more socially organized society, you never want to lose that idea of freedom. It's kind of like, freedom of speech really only works when you hate the speech, because we all want to keep the speech that we agree with.
Right.
But that guy over there saying the vilest thing ever, that's actually the speech you have to protect. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. And so that kind of freedom would be the area of operations, I think, that when if a calamity, like you said, were to happen, we would operate in.
And I think that, forming a perfect society, or in any event, expecting society to act perfectly and 0% evilly is not going to happen, right? Like, I'm a big proponent of, I believe human beings are naturally good.
Right.
I also strongly believe that all human beings, even the best of us, have some darkness. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's about appealing to that.
I agree.
Yeah, man. The shadow is very much a part of everything else, right? There's a balance, and it's important to maintain that.
This has turned into a fascinating discussion.
Right?
Right?
And
we started off with the Black Plague, and we're talking about human nature. Yeah, this has been great, man. Does anybody else have anything? I think we're kind of rolling in on the time that we would like to spend on this. Does anybody have anything that they thought about and they haven't brought to the attention, and they want to talk about it?
Yeah.
Come on.
How did you guys react to the most recent outbreak of Ebola? And how does that influence and educate what we've been talking about now?
Fascinating.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting, because, so most of the people in this room probably weren't in Africa where it was happening.
No, yeah.
But, having said that, it's not like I was, anywhere close to ground zero, right? I was quite far away, but it was, and when I say I was there, this is the initial outbreak, right? I was a kid back then. And I just remember seeing the news.
What year was that?
But I'm pretty sure it was the 90s. I can definitely look that up. But I'm pretty sure it was the 90s. Mm-hmm. And I just remember being like really, really afraid, because you're just seeing like all these bodies being thrown into these mass graves and being covered with some kind of powder of, I'm like, dude, what is going on? People were dying in such large numbers and so quickly. But then, so there was that side of it, but then, there's a hopeful side where you see the effort, to try and call, this, massive, tragedy, that's taking place, and all these doctors and these people that are putting their lives, at risk. Some of them contracted the Ebola. There's actually a story of the more recent outbreak. There's a doctor that, contracted it and was able to survive, and he went right back, to, work and try and save people. So for me, back then, there was definitely an element of, like fear, especially not understanding a lot about this disease and what it's capable of. I just saw the fallout. And so I'm like, that's the same continent. I mean, there's no reason why it can't make its way here. Mm-hmm. Now it's a little bit, different. I know a little bit more, when it happened, I could go and follow what was going on online, but we're back to that, technology and like how it's really, helped us, figure out ways to cope, with some of these things that happen. And that's definitely one way I do it. I try and find out as much as I can, whether it's true or not. Yeah, now I feel more hopeful because just like, when we talked about battlefield medicine, eventually those deaths started going down because they figured stuff out, right? Yeah. And that's exactly where we're at. And you saw how the whole thing played out more recently. Some of the people that contracted Ebola when they were in Africa and ended up back here on U.S. soil, there was a massive effort to, get them, quarantined and then start like pulling resources to try and figure out how to help this person. Really in an effort to stop, the spread, right? But also to save, the individuals, because I'm pretty sure it's a different strain, right? And that's exactly what happened, right? So, it's just interesting to see how these things take place, because even the plague still is around, right? But it only kills about 11%. Was that the number?
I think something like that, yeah.
But it's still like fatal. It's definitely going to, it'll kill you.
You still don't want to get it.
You still don't want to get it. Yeah. It's not the cold. It's not influenza.
I think there's about 10 cases a year in the United States.
Right.
Well.
Right. Yeah. So.
Could be wrong.
10 cases, huh?
Think so.
Yeah, that's more than I would.
Of specifically the plague?
Bubonic plague.
Bubonic plague.
So first of all, David, that was a great question. I want to ask you some more questions based upon David's question, Adrian. What was the dialogue like during that initial Ebola outbreak between you and your family, you and your friends, you and your classmates, all that stuff? Also in terms of like when you would hear adults speak, what was being said on the news?
Another thing I want to add real quick. It's interesting, the question you asked before, like what would happen if someone in my family got sick during a plague like this? How would I react? If you look at it on a large scale, the U.S. was that family, and anyone coming from Africa who had Ebola was like that family member that was sick, and then looking at how we dealt with it.
You're right. The American.
Fascinating. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think so. Yeah, when he was talking about that example of, if someone gets, gets a plague in your house, that's what I was thinking about. I was like, the whole Ebola thing that played out, in Africa. So to answer the question, so what was the conversation about? First off, as kids, we weren't really like talking about it, right? This was something that we were more witnessing, and kind of experiencing from, that lens. Like we're kids, we're seeing the rest of the world react, the news, parents in the home. And I mean, generally there were just a lot of questions. It was more about, oh man, so there was just so much mystery around this. All the questions you can expect, right? Like, what is this? We know it's called Ebola, but how is it killing people so fast? People just wanted to know more, and just the shock of, the imagery, right? Like you're not even there. Like imagine being in the area, like with the plague, they were talking about like socially how devastating it was to see piles and piles of bodies on these carts, right? For many people who are, in the part of the continent, that's what they got to experience because, it was very close. It was around the corner. These were your neighbors, that were experiencing this. Then the other part of it is there was a lot of migration because those people out there were like super scared, right? And so they started to migrate to all kinds of different places. And then you see some of the people in the nations that the host nations, how they're reacting, right? So they're trying, even as much as they want to practice compassion, they also want to protect, their own. So they create these camps, right? To try and figure out how they can perhaps, perform some kind of triage. Like, okay, fine, you can come in, but we have to like make sure everything's on the up and up with whoever we do let in, because we're not trying to have this thing, spread like wildfire. Cause I mean, it already is kind of doing that,
By harming those around you, you're not doing anyone very much good.
Exactly. So yeah, we definitely witnessed those kind of things happening because it's very much like, war. Like when you have something, pandemic of that, nature just come in, that's exactly, you see similar things happening. People want to, figure out a way to, make it to safety. That created, a whole other layer of, concern. So yeah, as a kid, I was just observing And I just saw everyone was just very curious. Obviously, because we were so far from, I grew up in East Africa. And a lot of what was going on was happening, a long way from where we were at. And actually not too far. I mean, it definitely could have made its way to us, which is why, everyone was trying to keep tabs, making sure. I just remember being kind of pissed off because of how much the news was always on, man. And I was like, dude, what happened to cartoon time, man? So the social impact on me was just like huge, right? I'm like, there's no balance in this house. It's all CNN, and I don't know that we're helping by watching this much news. Very selfish. Yeah, I just wanted to, Cartoon Network, man. And it's happened a few times, in Africa. I was just reading, like, initially, there was in 1976 was one of the first times, Ebola was brought up. And that was, let me see. So yeah, that was most recent, which was 2014 to 2016. There was, 1994, Cote d'Ivoire. And then I believe, if I'm not wrong, I don't know if it was both of these, cause I mean, I was, a little kid at this point. In 1994 and 1995, there were, those two outbreaks, one in Cote d'Ivoire and one in Zaire. And the one in Zaire is definitely the one that I remember, as a kid.
Yeah, I remember that too.
Yeah. I was pretty frightened.
And it's so interesting because you actually probably the closest here in the room to experiencing an event like that. Where there, even though it didn't turn into that kind of pandemic, right? There was the possibility, and you were having to deal with that possibility. So my understanding is we're talking a few thousand miles, right?
Yeah, so Zaire is also like formerly known as the DRC,
right?
Democratic Republic of Congo. That is Central
Africa, right?
So we're east. It's just as, it could have gone west, it could have gone east. We're close enough.
But
they speak Swahili in Zaire.
Yeah, right.
so
I guess my point would be, what is it, about 3,000 miles from New York to LA?
Yeah,
so
exactly, right.
It would be as if, I lived in LA and this is happening in Ohio, right?
Right.
So, think about that. How would we feel, right?
Right. It's just the local governments that really, probably all of those local governments, all those borders around there, right? Those are the people that kept it from, spreading as much as it could have. Because it's not like a lot of the people, if you think about that time back then, as far as socioeconomic status goes, not a lot of people could afford to fly, right? So you're not having a mass exodus by plane. So, which ensures the spread to be much quicker, right? You're talking about people making their way out of that country on foot.
Right.
Because that the majority were of that socioeconomic status, right? They were just, farmers and, little communities, like real actual villages.
Right.
Villagers, right?
Much easier to contain than here, where it might be, even if it were 24 hours before the government took action, how many people would be like we talked about earlier, you know what? I have a little bit of knowledge. We're leaving right now. We're getting on the plane right now.
Right.
That would actually spread it way quicker.
Way quicker, right? Well, there's that semi-famous movie with Bruce Willis, 12 Monkeys, right? And that's the whole plan, is it starts in the airport and then all these people leave from there.
Yes.
Yeah, dangerous stuff.
It is.
So going on to something you mentioned about selfishness. So in 2014, when there was a small Ebola outbreak in the U.S., one of the first things that I remember coming to my mind was looking around who has it around me? And that selfish element of I got to protect myself from everyone around me. And it was almost this suspicion. It reminds me now of fear of communism during the Cold War.
Right.
And how everyone was suspicious of everyone around them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Oh man, I feel that every winter when the cold starts going around, right? I'm looking at all my friends and family nope.
The other week you scared me. I went home started sanitizing my whole apartment.
Right?
That dude, I don't know. No one loves having the cold, but I particularly despise having the cold, man. And so I just get real suspicious. I'm just looking at all my friends and family you're a carrier, man.
Right? It's so funny because Adrian will change how he shakes your hand, or if he shakes your hand, based on the season.
Yeah.
Right? So like,
Wow.
the traditional like slap of that's not happening for part of the year. It's fist bump, just fist bump, which is actually smart, right?
Yeah.
I was talking with somebody the other day. You spread things because you touch something and then you touch some part of your face.
Yes.
How often we do that.
Yes.
Right? And it's like Owen says, you could be in that situation and you could know everything to do. And then one time you eat a cracker because you're hungry.
Right.
And you forgot to wash your hands and now you're dead.
Yes.
It's like, man,
Yes.
at least it's just the cold, which sucks, right? Because
Yes.
I just had it this week. But,
Ooh.
yeah, exactly, right? Everybody's spread out now. But it's funny because as much as you try, the reason the cold is so successful as a thing is because you don't even know you got it when you're
Spreading it.
yeah.
When
And
you're
Adrian's pointed
yeah.
that out. Like it's not really when you're sick, although you still don't want to cough in people's faces. It's the 2 or 3 days before you actually feel symptoms, but you've
Yeah.
got the cold. That's when you're spreading it.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting thing to bring up. And I think the Black Plague for me is particularly scary because most illnesses, if they're really deadly, it itself kills all its hosts really quickly. And if it's really deadly, oftentimes it takes a really long time to transmit. There's very few that are easy to transmit and very deadly. And if there's an incubation period of even a couple days, and it seemed like with the Black Death there was that's terrifying. That is like the biological thing that could wipe out humanity as those characteristics.
Yeah, exactly. Like, because that's the cold. What makes it so effective, right? It doesn't kill you,
Yeah.
so it continues. And usually something that's super deadly kills the people that would carry it before they spread it, so they don't spread it.
If we quarantined everyone
Exactly.
that had the cold, it would probably decrease the amount of people that get it. But it's
Right.
not that severe that we're like, oh yeah,
Right,
I can
exactly.
still go to work, I can still go to school, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The hassle of those people being quarantined would almost be a bigger hassle than
Yes.
myself having the cold. I'm like, oh, why isn't the bus working? Or like,
Right.
oh, I can't go to this place for food today, whatever.
Right.
And honestly, everyone fist bumping instead of shaking hands would probably be a way better method to go about it,
Exactly. Yeah.
We should just start a campaign.
right?
Bump for bubonic.
Oh, it's great.
It adds an interesting question. We can look back then and we can say, oh, this that they did, that they did, stupid, ignorant, uneducated, whatever. Something even like handshaking today is one of those things that in the future people may look back on and be like, wow, I can't believe they did that. How,
You know,
like the amount
weirdos.
of money that cost them and amount of lives.
Right.
Yeah.
And like, what a stupid thing for the
So
species to
crazy.
do.
I was thinking the other day, like, what are we going to look back on in 50 years and be like, that wasn't very smart? And handshaking is a really good contender.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is such an ancient tradition meant to show that you're not armed, right? But now it's like, well, you get lessons on it. You got to have a firm handshake. You got to look him in the eye.
Yeah.
You know,
In fact, you need to show you are armed with integrity.
exactly. Yeah.
And
It's-
respect.
Yes.
Right.
when it
Strength.
really is not a useful tradition anymore. Like, I don't have to grip your hand and know that you're not carrying a weapon, right? But, people do what people do.
Yeah. We like tradition.
Yeah, we like tradition.
It's safe. It's familiar. There's all these things that we love about it, right?
Yeah. But sometimes it's not advantageous.
No.
And that's why, if it continued to be an issue, it would be interesting is if we lived in a time where there were a plague like that or something going on, I bet you it ends like that,
Modern medicine.
And then 20 years from now, nobody would do it.
Yep.
Man.
Fascinating stuff.
Modern medicine is something that this has made me very grateful for.
Absolutely.
Soap,
Right?
hand sanitation, mentioned hazmat suit earlier.
Yeah.
All sorts of like technological, public health, even infrastructural things that allowed us to live the lifestyle that we live today is
Easy dissemination of information, education, big time.
Like you were saying, a big thing that people want when something is going on is education, just to know what's happening.
Right.
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 And I think of the method of getting that information, right, which was developed a few hundred years after that we still use today to ascertain the difference between myth and truth. And it comes from that evidence-based, I'm not going to look at the world and determine my theory and then fit the facts.
Yeah.
I'm going to look at the facts and let that lead me to the theory that we can operate under. It's a much better way to live as far as building a society, because it's allowed us to have, hospitals that actually work as best as we can make them currently, and they're constantly improving. And that's the whole idea of the method, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So we've had a really wide-ranging discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we are actually coming up on the limit of our time without making this a double episode, although we could probably sit down and have this discussion for another 2 or 3 hours.
Probably.
I think what we've learned here is that we're going to have to bring this back together and just discuss some interesting things from time to time. I mean, it's great when we have people like Kwika on, who is just amazing, and then Baird before her, amazing.
Yep.
And I think just a little preview, we're going to have some shows about some of the stories around this table, which are going to be fascinating. But it's also just fascinating to sit down and talk about a historical topic and then bring it into the present day.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
It's been a great thought experiment, man. Yes. And you two guys have been fantastic, because it was so interesting to see how it turned. Like, usually we're the ones asking the questions, and you guys were like, hey, how would you react? It was fascinating.
It was great.
This has been a fantastic episode. I thank everybody for allowing me to be a part of it.
Yeah, Where did we start?
So I think we started with
quick recap.
With Aaron giving a quick recap. Hey, a lot of people died. It was during this time frame.
Right.
It was caused by this illness.
Yeah.
I think that was where we started, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And then we just moved on from there, right? We talked about some of the history, like you said. Then we got into the science of it. And then I think the best part was when y'all started turning it into what would we do today. Right? And then becomes
the social.
The social.
Right?
Yes. And historical.
Yeah.
What occurred in society, right?
Yeah, man.
Right, like bring ourselves to that time period, put ourselves in their shoes.
Yeah. I think that's one thing we didn't do with the battlefield medicine episode that would have made it fascinating. If these two guys had been here for that, I mean, it was great.
It was great. But I think that is the beauty of, and when we first started the podcast, right, we agreed that the journey and seeing ourselves and others seeing the growth, right, bringing other people in, bringing in all these different ideas to continue to build and develop, how we present. It was part of the appeal.
Exactly. And now it's happening. Fantastic.
Yeah, it's happening.
Yeah. This is just exciting stuff coming up for 2teachone. We are really advancing in new directions we did not imagine when
not
began.
even in the slightest.
No. But it's super exciting, and both of these gentlemen are a part of it, and we just can't wait, and we hope that you stick around and join us on this ride, join this community,
Yeah, man. We're super psyched. Yeah, and if you really want to join us, join this community, feel free to do so. We are on Facebook and Instagram at TWOTEACHONE. You can also reach us by sending us an email, through our website, and that's at www.2teachone.com. That's www, 2teachone.com.
2teachone.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Aaron and Adrian, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Really.
I don't think this will be the last one, David.
No, definitely not. No. Not with your energy and your insight. It was,
and
it was a pleasure.
And the beard. How do you forget the beard, man?
Well, because I'm jealous of beards, because I don't actually grow one very well, so I tend to just pretend they don't exist. All right. Moving on. No, it's a fantastic beard. It's a fantastic beard. My man Owen over here has also a fantastic beard.
Dude, he tamed his, man.
Yeah, he tamed it recently, but it's a work.
Yes.
It's great.
Yes.
I wanted to thank you guys, Aaron and Adrian, for having me, and David, buddy. I think we'll be back. I love this format. I love the idea of picking a topic, specifically a historical one, and dissecting it and just talking about it.
Absolutely, man. We'll do it again.
Stuff.
Yeah.
All right. So for everybody listening,
my name's Adrian.
My name's Aaron.
My name's Owen.
And I'm David.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time.
2teachone.